Well, hello, and welcome back to the Fertility Podcast. Had a little bit of a break in January. Well, I didn't really have a break because I've been scurrying around like I'm on a hamster wheel. But I have had a little break from publishing because I wanted to get everything ready for February. I wasn't doing dry January, I wasn't being a vegan, I didn't make any New Year's resolutions, but I have managed to walk to the wrong end of a car park as I'm just leaving the cool workspace that I've been working in. Anyway, this podcast series is all about alternative parenting, and it's something that I've been working on for a while to give you an insight into what's involved if it's basically going to take 3 to make your baby. What you're going to hear is conversations with a brilliant counsellor who herself was adopted. She then adopted her second child after dealing with secondary infertility. You'll hear from a solo mum who decided to have a baby on her own and her experience of becoming a solo mum. She's someone that I've spoken to before, so I'll link to that episode about the whole decision to be a solo mum. But I wanted to catch up with her almost a year into her journey of being a solo mum to really hear what it's like. Things that you might not have thought about. Obvious things, less obvious things. You'll hear from a lady who's got an amazing organisation which is like a global egg bank and one of her donors. You'll also hear from a lawyer talking about all the things you need to consider when you are thinking about using a donor, adopting, co-parenting, using a surrogate, and the idea that thinking about the legal side of things as far as consent and issues if you're going abroad early on can hopefully help you kind of foresee any potential problems, and you kind of got everything covered, or at least you know who you can talk to rather than something going wrong. I'm not saying that it will, but if it does, knowing who you can talk to. You'll also hear from a guy who's a sperm donor and how he's working. He's in Australia. He's got quite a fascinating approach to what he does. And with him, so funny, a guy just walked past me as I was saying the word sperm donor. You'll also hear from a lady who he's donated to. Didn't expect that when we had the conversation. They were in an Airbnb in Australia. I probably sound a bit bewildered in the conversation, but you can be the judge of that when we get to it. And you'll be hearing from a lovely lady called Jo who had a baby with her partner Jane, and she talks about what went wrong in her scenario to, again, hopefully give you that insight as to what could go wrong, knowing the questions to ask, which is, it's always fun walking past a big factory when you're trying to record a podcast intro. What I'm hoping to achieve from this podcast series is just to give you all sorts to think about, all sorts to consider, and then you can ask more questions. I can help direct you to other podcast episodes that might be of relevance. But hopefully what it will do is help answer some of your questions, help steer you towards some people that can help you, and help you realise that, you know, this has been done before. People have gone there already, and that's why this community is here for you. So before we crack on, delighted to share my new sponsors for 2019, and here's a bit of info about them, and they're amazing for supporting the Fertility Podcast because they help make it happen.
This podcast is sponsored by International Andrology, who specialise in diagnosing and treating male infertility. Around 50% of infertility issues are male factor, and all too often, men aren't even evaluated at the start of a fertility journey, which might result in unnecessary treatments, costs, and disappointment. International Andrology is one of the few specialist clinics in the UK offering a holistic approach to increase your chances to conceive naturally or via the IVF route. As well as treating the underlying causes of male infertility, their doctors have some of the highest success rates in microsurgical sperm retrieval. So, if you're looking for a true specialist to assist you on your fertility journey, visit london-andrology.co.uk today and do mention the Fertility Podcast. Bud Fertility Supplements have been created to support you in your pursuit of parenthood. Whether you're just starting out or have been trying to conceive for a while, Bud's innovative vegan formulas contain adaptogens, minerals, and vitamins proven to support vital aspects of reproductive health and function. Go to littlebud.com and use the code FP20 to receive 20% off your order. So go forth and multiply. Yes, amazing to have you guys on board. Right. If you want to get in touch with me, do follow me on my socials. You can do @FertilityPoddy on Instagram, on Twitter. The Fertility Podcast has a page on Facebook, and I have a closed Facebook group called Talk Fertility, which is such a lovely community. I've got some of my former guests who are experts in their own fields as admin. So it's not just me trying to field your questions with previous podcast episodes that could help, but they're there to get involved, and everybody is just being amazing. We're doing more Facebook Lives in there, so if you'd like to get involved, it'd be lovely to have you there. If you get the chance to rate and review this podcast, it would be amazing. It's ace to know what you think, but it also tells other people that this is worth their ear holes. And stay till the end. I'll give you the show notes of how you can find out more about Jana. And here she is now. So I'm now delighted to welcome Jana Rutno, who is a fertility counsellor. She's also an author of the book 3 Makes Baby, How to Parent Your Donor-Conceived Child. And as part of this alternative parenting series that I'm sharing with you, I was really interested in talking with Jana, not just about her own experience, but about the book and the work that she does. So welcome to the podcast, Jana.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, I love that I found you. I think we connected on Instagram, but there's so many different kind of parts of what you do and your story that are so relevant to what I'm trying to convey with this series. First of all, let's talk a bit about you before we talk about your book and the work that you do, because your own kind of journey, your background is also connected into what you're doing now, isn't it? Just tell me a bit about your own upbringing.
Yeah, so my husband and I got pregnant in 2000 with our first child, pretty easily, had an easy pregnancy, but couldn't get pregnant again, to our surprise. And as you know, that's secondary infertility. So after years of no success, we decided to adopt. And we were always open to adoption. I myself was adopted at 6 weeks old as a baby, and I have a twin brother, so we were both adopted into the same family. So we were open to it. And so we started that process of adoption and adopted our daughter from China in 2005, actually. And after that, I really was, having gone through infertility myself for so many years, I felt called to really help other women, and really was drawn to the field and was basically counseling other couples going through the adoption process at first. So when we first returned with our own daughter and through our own adoption process, I was counseling others, and then switched over to begin counseling people that were doing other choices, that were making other choices. You know, maybe adoption didn't work out. I remember one couple, young couple, they couldn't have their own children, and they had 2 adoptions fall through. And so I just remember how heartbroken they were that 2 babies had been taken back from them, and just the losses that they felt and the grief they felt, and they just couldn't tolerate another loss. And so they were looking at another option to have a baby because the adoptions didn't work out for them.
Had your adoption experience with your daughter been relatively straightforward?
So it took 2 years.
Right.
And which was a long time, and we did have some hiccups. We had some paperwork fall through at the last minute. We weren't sure if they lost our paperwork. This was after waiting 2 years. It just kind of got a little bit twisted at the end, but it worked out. We ended up having to travel alone instead of traveling in a group, and so there was definitely some trouble at the end after the long waiting process that made it even more difficult. But it ended up being exactly what was right for us, and Jade, our daughter, is the one that was definitely meant for us. And so, yeah.
And from your own upbringing, you talked about you and your brother being adopted. Did that help you get your head around that relationship that you'd potentially have with adopting a child, that there wouldn't be, as I hear, some of the fears and concerns of that bond if you are going to go down the adoption route? And you'd obviously experienced it firsthand with the relationship you had with your parents.
Yes, so my parents did have a biological child after my twin brother and I. 4 years later, my mom was able to her surprise, to have a baby after multiple miscarriages. So I also have a little brother who I'm not biologically related to. And so, yeah, my whole life has been relating to family who I don't have genetic ties to, with the exception of my twin brother. But we're a family, and that's all I've ever known, for sure.
And that's what I found really fascinating about talking to you, because you've lived through this experience firsthand, as well as from your own direct family, as well as then the family you've gone on to have of your own.
For sure, because, the story really, for me, repeated itself as a parent. So I was an adoptee as a child, and now I'm an adoptive parent. So I really get to see it from both sides, how I experienced growing up and being raised in an adoptive family, or a family that's not genetically related fully, and then now being the parent of a child who I'm not genetically related to, and what that feels like and what that is like and the challenges of that. So I definitely write from a personal experience as well as professional, because I've worked with a lot of couples that have lots of different stories that are different than mine as well. So.
And at what point did you think, right, there's a book in this experience this journey that I'm on?
Oh my goodness. I think I knew, honestly, when I was 20 years old and I was flying on an airplane to meet my birth parents for the first time, to meet my birth father. And I was thinking back at that time to this chance meeting, back to another airplane ride when I was sitting next to a man. I was on my way to New York City for the first time by myself. And I was sitting next to a very nervous older man, and he was scribbling in a notepad. And he said, I'm a psychologist, and I'm on my way to meet my birth mother for the very first time in New York City. And she's an older Italian woman, and she's dying. And I remember at the time I was 20 and thinking, or I was 18, and I remember thinking, wow, what are the chances that I'm sitting next to this doctor? And he said, if you ever want to meet your birth family, call me and I'll help you. And then at that moment I knew something pretty special was happening, and I had a story to share, and it would be 15 years later, or longer, 20 years later, before I would meet my birth mother, and he was the liaison for us. So he was the first person to call my birth father on the phone and connect us. Shortly after that, I began writing the book.
Wow, okay. Because part of the conversation that you have in your book, and it's so prominent in the work that you do, is about the telling of a child's story. And obviously you've gone through that experience. What age did your parents tell you about your background?
So I always knew. They started talking about it when I was a baby, I assume. My mom said that she would introduce us back then as, these are my adopted children. We don't really do that anymore, but back in the day, that's how they introduced, that's how they recommended that you introduce your children. And so my parents talked about it with me from the very beginning, so I have no actual memory of finding out. I just always knew that was my story. Yeah.
Because you talk about in your book, which we'll move on to, you talk about the 5 main issues that you help people with. And obviously the child's well-being is a huge part of the consideration here, whether the child has been adopted or donor conceived. You've described kind of the perfect scenario, okay, a bit old-fashioned in the way that your parents spoke about it, but the fact that there wasn't this big shock. And I remember I had a friend at school when I was probably about 7 years old. I said to her, and this is the most, ridiculous, naive thing, but I said to my friend, why have you got blue eyes and your sister's got brown eyes? And she said to me, because I'm adopted. And I went, oh, right, fine. But the fact that I even asked that question, I mean, that shows the innocence of my question. And her response was so innocent. But she'd obviously been told she was in a family where the sister she was talking about was the biological child of her parents, and her older brother were both adopted. And I don't think it was something that was kept from them. I think they were very comfortable with it, which was, and the way that she talked about it and the way that we all knew about it, it wasn't a thing at all. But that's not always the case, is it?
No, it's not. And in fact, that changed. I don't know exactly the time frame that began to change, but adoption used to be a secret as well. Families were told to keep adoption a secret. And then that changed. They realized that wasn't helpful, that children needed to know and understand their genetic differences. And so within the donor conception world, so to speak, it began under the same theme of this secret, with this secrecy. And so early on, when donation conception was first happening, it was done in doctors' offices, and it was very secret. And it was and sometimes even the earliest cases, even the women didn't know. And so because it started with that and has that history, we're still overcoming that. And it's getting much more, people are becoming much more open and comfortable with talking about it, especially I've noticed in the last 5 years. But there's still that idea that we need to keep it a secret, and families feel, with that secret, they feel this sense of shame about their family and their family story. And so that's the reason I wanted to write this book, is I really wanted to help families to be able to let go of that shame and not feel that, and not then pass that on to their children, but to have a sense of comfort and confidence about their family and their family story.
Because in that first issue, that the child's well-being, talking about how the child will feel, haven't there been studies showing that children that have kind of been brought up with their story are much better placed than those who have it hidden from them and maybe get that shock telling?
Yes, and so when kids find out earlier, they really accept the information more effortlessly than if they find out later in life. For whatever reason, children are just able to absorb information and accept it as truth, and they're comfortable with it. They take their cues from their parents. If their parents are comfortable with it, they're comfortable with it too. That's not to say they don't have challenges, or they won't have challenges along the way.
Sure.
And I do speak to those challenges in the book, but those are just like any life challenges, things that we can handle and we can address. And as a parent, we can help guide them through that. So.
And we touched on this, the second point of your 5, this parent legitimacy. You've demonstrated from your own experience about the connection, but it is a concern, isn't it? Whether it's, again, an adopted child or donor-conceived child, that the parent might not feel there is that connection.
Yes, and so there's the idea that a lot of people have only experienced family as genetic family.
Yeah. And
so to them, family means biology. And so what we do is just kind of have to redefine that in a way for people and say, family is so much more. It's really a bond. It's shared time. It's a bond. It's an attachment to people that you spend time with. And so that really can help parents to feel more at ease that the family life is so much more than just genetics. And it's just because a lot of times they just haven't experienced that. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some families that have, are uncomfortable with genetic differences. That can happen as well. So, that's why I move on and talk about those family and cultural differences, and what do you do if your family is just against you having a child that's not part of the family tree, so to speak.
Yeah.
So,
well, let's talk more about that, because obviously, if your family is close and you want them to be a part of this exciting new this exciting new chapter that you're going through, you want everybody to experience the joy that you are. And if you're if you've been trying for a long time and you've been wanting to give your parents grandchildren, all of those things that come with a natural route to becoming a parent, you want to share those. And so if people are struck with barriers, how do you how do you start to help them overcome that and help their family accept the situation?
Yeah, and so a lot of times what happens is it kind of redefines your relationships and families. So, if a family member, a mother or father, is just adamantly against this way of building your family, and this is your only way to be a parent, this is where I will talk about setting boundaries, really, and being able to have that comfort level, and you can make this decision, and you can be different from your family, and families can recover from it, and they can go on to become more accepting over time. I've seen so many families change, that they started out against it, and then over time they changed, they softened, they were able to accept the differences and really embrace a new definition of family. And so I say give it time, and I say know that you have boundaries there, and you have the right to make decisions for growing your family that may not be what your parents or your family support. If it's a cultural difference, sometimes that's a little bit more difficult to deal with. So I've had clients that fly in from Brazil or other countries where it is, Peru, it's absolutely unacceptable to be, to have a child this way. And so they tell me there is no way we can talk about this. This absolutely has to be a secret. And so, obviously I still educate them and tell them the same things I would tell anyone else, but I do understand that some cultures it's very, very difficult to have this family difference. And so, there's gonna be obstacles, but there are definitely ways to work through it.
When there is the more extreme example that you've just said, is that more often than not due to the family's concern of what other people would think, do you think?
Sometimes it is. Yeah. Sometimes it is. And so that's that social differences that really can come up when people are afraid of being different or bringing attention to it. If my child looks different than me, how will I answer those questions when they say, where did her red hair come from? How will I say, how will I answer that? Will I basically have to be dishonest and say, make something up, or will I be able to be honest? And so that can be difficult too. Is how do we work this socially? And if we feel different from other families, is that something that we can feel comfortable with? How do we explain this to other people? And so that's definitely can be concerning for some people, for some families.
Because I guess a part of it in that sense is that especially if you've had a challenging ride with your own family, to then have to constantly be talking about it to justify the red hair every time, it's a constant thing, isn't it? So what kind of thing do you tell people to be honest if outsiders are asking those questions, or do you give them like little tools to come up with a creative answer?
Yeah, so what you do is you get really creative and you get really skilled at social interactions. I tell them that, it's really their right. There's a difference between privacy and secrecy, and we have the right to privacy. We have the right to not share information that's personal about us or our family with someone if we don't want to. And then that's not secrecy. Secrecy is keeping information from people who really need to know. So keeping the secret from a child about their genetic makeup that's information they need to know for lots of reasons, for health reasons, for identity development. And so that's more what we would consider secret. But if someone asks you where her red hair came, it kind of depends on who it is. Is it an acquaintance? Is it a close family member? Is it a stranger? And so certainly with strangers, I tell people, you don't have to share. Yeah. With strangers, you can, find ways to dodge that or distract them from the question, or just
everybody has myths about red hair, how it skips a generation yeah. and it's the dominant or the recessive. It's hilarious.
Yeah, there you go. There's always creative ways to find answers that are not dishonest and not modeling shamefulness to your child. So let's say your child's just right there in the grocery cart with you, and they pick up on your sense of dodginess or in a negative way, or shame or embarrassment, or I don't know how to discomfort, being uncomfortable, then that can be something, if they see over and over and over, they can kind of internalize that. And so I do encourage parents to find and continue to develop that skill of interacting and find that right voice for them and for their family of how to communicate it with others.
I do want to talk in a moment about the child's feelings more, but there's just one more point within your 5 main issues about, does it really matter if we don't tell? And I know that you, in the book, have exercises. One of them is, do you want to tell your child? And you kind of challenge people to complete that exercise, because it's almost easier, isn't it? It's like when there's something that you just can't deal with, it's like, don't do anything about it, just avoid head in the sand type mentality. Is that more often than not what people do, or are we getting braver as society talks more about modern families and we see more variety of in the way that we have families? Are we getting better at accepting that it matters?
I think we're getting better. I think it's very recent, and I think that even if we look at studies just a couple years ago, most people still had not told their child by the time they were 9 years old. And so, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just they took that time. They needed that time to get comfortable, and they weren't sure how to do it. And it's kind of like, how do we talk about this? It's just easier not to talk about it until that point when you realize you do, and then you're like, now it's kind of, we're far down the line, and now it's gotten even more uncomfortable to talk about it because we don't know how to bring it up. and we don't know how our child's older now and they understand more, so we don't really know how they're going to react. So that can be pretty unnerving. And so that's why I encourage, just go ahead and start talking about it right away. You know, you don't have to talk, it's not like you're talking about it a lot, but you're just planting those seeds of the information. So it's always kind of there. It's that foundation. Just like I always knew, your child will then just always know. So.
Because telling a child later then leaves them feeling confused and betrayed, and there's a real negative element to that, and it's almost selfish from the parent. They're protecting themselves, not their child, aren't they?
Yes, in a way, and they're maybe also dealing with unresolved grief, unresolved emotions from the infertility, feelings of being different, feelings of isolation, and feelings of, lots of different emotions that have come up during the infertility process. And so telling a child later, so let's say around their teenage years, we do have studies that show that they can become they can feel betrayed. They can feel like confusion, like who really am I? And so, yeah, there can definitely be more negative responses later in life if they find out, especially if they find out from someone they didn't expect or from someone other than their parents, or if they find out under a negative circumstance, say a divorce or some other kind of health crisis that now we need to know. That's just a more stressful time to find that information out, and it can just add more challenges in whatever you're going through at that time, because now you've got this whole issue of who am I? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you lie to me?
That just would be so awful, wouldn't it?
It would be hard, and I've talked to people that have experienced that and just how confusing that is when they find out later. And so, sometimes they're still not even able to fully express it to their parents when they find out, and they have to, kind of do their own work in working through some of those negative feelings. The ones that can feel and say, I'm upset and I feel betrayed to their parents, those are great situations because they can talk to their parents about it, and their parents are open to hearing those negative feelings. Well, I tell parents at that phase, if you do tell your child when they're a teenager and they're just finding out, expect some shock and sadness and grief, and it's okay. They may just not want to talk about it at all. So there's all the kinds of conflicting emotions that come with it. And so it's those mixed emotions, the ability to be able to tolerate that is really helpful in families that are genetically different. Genetic loss really is a core loss for some people. Not all people, but for some people, that inability to have a genetic child, to pass on their legacy, to be immortalized, so to speak, is really a core loss. And so when we're dealing with core loss, grief almost always follows loss. It's certainly going to follow a core loss. People don't necessarily realize they're grieving. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had people come to my office and we talk it through, and I say, this is grief. And they say, oh my gosh, you're right. This is grief. This makes sense. And it gives them permission to feel. Because up until this point, a lot of them feel like, this is hard. Why am I not tougher? Why is this so difficult for me to deal with? And so what I say is, you have experienced loss, not just one, but multiple losses. And when we have multiple losses that accumulate over time, as we do in the infertility journey, with loss of pregnancy, loss of procedure, the procedure failure, miscarriage, just the inability to get pregnant every month, that we have these losses that add up. They accumulate into what we call compounded grief. And so it's not simple grief, and no grief is simple. But for lack of a better way to say it, it is more complicated than just regular grief. And so when people are going through that, it's like you've got to allow the feelings to come through and to acknowledge what you've lost, to be able to let it go. And because if we hold on to what we wanted, then we tend to carry, I say grief time travels through families, because we tend to repress that grief, hold on to the dream that was broken, the dream we didn't get. And it comes out in negative ways, maybe through our parenting, or maybe just through our anger and frustration. And so letting that process, acknowledging the loss and letting that process work through, and knowing that's normal and a healthy way to move through it, and giving people permission to do that. So that really can help just them to know that it's normal to feel that way. Sometimes they just feel like I'm supposed to be happy. It can even happen after they have their baby home. I'm supposed to be happy now. What happened? Why am I still upset? Why do I still feel sadness? And I will, I will tell people this is normal. Grief will come and it will kind of, there'll be layers, and then you'll work through another layer, and then maybe even a year later something will pop back up. I had a woman come back to me after her child was 2. She was donor conceived. She had an adoption fall through as well. And she came back to me because she felt like the adoption loss was actually interfering with her ability to parent her 2-year-old. She loved her 2-year-old. Wow, she was so happy she had made the decision. But that she was still feeling grief from losing that first baby that she needed to talk through. And we helped connect some dots and helped kind of make some meaning through her process, and that really helped.
Because there's such guilt, isn't there? I've got this, I should be happy, like you said, but I'm still thinking about this, and I should be content with my lot. So one of the things that I think is really apparent is that importance of the openness and the honesty and the telling, because often children quite like their story. They like to be able to share that they have a story in their little innocent way, don't they? And
yes.
That obviously positive relationship that they're then going to have, I think, is really essential to point out. And we talked about that concern people have about connection. I had a conversation with a very good friend of mine who now has had successful treatment, but after quite a few rounds of unsuccessful treatment, and there was a conversation about using a donor egg, she had said that her other half was adamant that wasn't going to be the way they were going to go. There was absolutely no way that he would entertain that idea, and so it's something that she didn't even entertain. As it happened, they had success and they have a baby. They're not. There's no conversation about going down any further treatment routes for any more children. But that imbalance, I suppose, in a decision-making scenario between a couple, I'm sure is something that you've had presented to you, have you, about how then those kind of conversations can develop, because you can obviously describe that the bonds can be created even if it's not a biological link.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that happens. And sometimes it will happen before they even decide to move forward with the process, like you mentioned. And sometimes there's even a disagreement after the child is here. I can think of 2 different situations, and where one of the couples was ready to talk about it and the other one wasn't. And so, in both of these cases, it was the sperm donation, and it was the father who was very uncertain and not ready to talk about it yet, and was struggling with some issues. So what I really see is for more attention to the males that have done sperm donation to have a child. Is that there's definitely, and research shows that too, that we need to really tend to their psychosocial needs a bit more than we are now. There's a lot of hurt there. There's in one sense they want to intellectualize it and they're able to, but on another sense there are those feelings of, wow, I didn't know it was me, and shame associated with that. The same feelings that women feel when they are going through infertility, those feelings of shame or something's wrong with me. And so, grieving that process, coming to terms with that process is, I've seen men do that, and both in my office and after they have a child.
It presents in so many different ways. Have you ever experienced a situation that you just that can't be resolved? Are you always in a position where you're able to help people through, or is there some sticking points, like, for example, they just won't tell the child? Have you ever had that?
For sure. I've had people, yes, and what happens is they get very angry with me, and defensive. These are very intense sessions sometimes, and I'm very tender with people, because I know these are such, life and death really topics, and so, at times I have people that just are too resistant, not able to come to terms with the telling, because they want to carry on as if it is their own child, and mask that and pretend that it is. And so, those are difficult situations, but I also believe that just because they leave my office feeling that way doesn't mean that they're going to feel that way in the next 2 years or 3 years. I do tell people, whatever you feel today will likely change. And so, be open and flexible and adaptable to this process, because, when your child is here and you're experiencing parenting, really things do change, and you do start to see things in a different way. And so I was like, it's okay. You don't have to know today for sure what you're going to do, but that you can just be open to being open.
I suppose one of the things that's really fascinating about the work you do and how you help people is that they can go on the journey with you. And one of the concerns that people might have is once they've overcome the telling of how their families come to be, how do they then deal with things when they might get difficult later on if they have told the child and there are kind of repercussions. There's the whole, as you described, about searching for your birth parents, or if it's a donor conceived child, finding out that information, all that comes with it. So what kind of advice do you offer people as their child, grows up?
Yeah, and so the good news is, like, from the beginning, if you tell from the beginning, it's pretty simple, because the children, it's usually a one-way conversation. They don't have many questions. And so that's preschool, baby years through preschool years. And then as we get into middle school years, you may have a few more questions about social comparisons and things like that. But when you get into the teenage years is when you're probably going to have the most maybe challenges or questions from your child. And that is when I really encourage parents to help their child to see both sides of their story. And because while it's great, we want to paint everything with one beautiful picture, like it's all wonderful and everything's so positive and wasn't this such a gift, you were a gift and we're a happy family, but they might have some negative emotions about it. They may have some feelings of loss and grief, that they lost a genetic piece, that they don't know information about who they are. And so that's okay. So the more that you're able to see both sides of those stories and to look at both sides of this complex issue, that you can teach them to do that too. And what we find is the most advanced level of thinking is something that psychologists have termed dialectical thinking. And that's when we really can look at two opposing ideas and we know they can be true at the same time. And so that means, yes, while I did lose a genetic connection, I am here because of this donor. Or yes, maybe this donor, it seems like they're so generous that they gave up their sperm or egg for me to be born, but they also got paid. And so these are two seemingly opposing ideas, but they can be merged, and you can kind of almost hold the tension between those two ideas and be okay. And so that's what both adopted children and donor-conceived children can do and learn to do as they go into that more advanced level of thinking, into adolescence, into understanding their life and their identity and kind of giving it meaning. And so that's I talk about that in the book a bit as well.
It's fascinating stuff. I mean, did you find yourself asking those kind of questions on your...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, when you were starting to wonder about your birth parents?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I went through it myself. And,
yeah.
I remember thinking, where's the silver lining for me? Where is, there's loss here and there's sadness and there's grief. But what did I gain? What makes me me? And what did this add to my story? And then what can I do to give back, is really the question. And so absolutely, I went through that in my own dialectical thinking process as well. Yeah.
I think for anybody listening who is thinking about any of the routes we've talked about, knowing what could be, it takes away that mystique and that fear of the unknown by having someone like you who's been through it, who's working with people, mapping out what could be. It's almost knowing the what if rather than the because that's also part of the frustrations with infertility is the unknown, and you just never know whether you're going to get that outcome that you desire. And so at least you can prepare yourself and you can help manage those expectations a bit more.
Because the what if is usually more scary than the what is,
Yeah.
So, or what comes to be, the what ifs are so much more scary. And fear is part of that whole grieving process. It can be part of it. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely, lovely talking to you. And we'll put all the details of all your social media and your website and the book, because the book's available on Amazon, so you can get it wherever you are. I've got it on my Kindle in front of me. So, Jana, thank you again. I know your dog went a bit crazy then, so the dog wants some attention. And good luck with the book. We're spreading the words,
so much.
Which we're doing right now, because it is a really, really interesting journey that you've shared of the different case studies. And you do give lots of different examples. There's different scenarios of people, which again is really interesting, as well as the exercises for people to complete. So it's like a practical workbook as well as a guide, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That's what I wanted it to be. I knew I could only do so much in one session with people, so I wanted to give them more that they could take home with them and do some work over time.
So much to take on board there, and I'm going to put loads of notes for you in the show notes of this episode, which are thefertilitypodcast.com/3 to make a baby, okay? If you're thinking about having a child through donor conception, the exercises that Jana has in her book, from what I've seen, are just so practical and straightforward and really helpful. So like I say, all the links will be there. I hope this has been useful for you. Always great to know what you think. If you want to email me, natalie@thefertilitypodcast.com. Next time it's going to be all about the legal side. So lots to consider ahead of journeying into making or completing your family, including a third person, or doing it in a more unconventional way. Hopefully I can give you lots more to think about. Thank you as always for your support. And until the next time,